June 12, 1937, Clarksdale, Mississippi. A Saturday night in the middle of summer when the heat hung in the air like a physical presence, thick and oppressive and inescapable. The kind of heat that made your clothes stick to your skin within seconds of stepping outside. The kind of heat that made your thoughts move slow like molasses poured on a winter morning. The kind of heat that made you desperate for relief, for distraction, for anything that would take your mind off the suffocating weight of another Delta summer pressing down on your chest like an invisible hand. The sun had set hours ago, but the temperature had barely dropped. The air was still and humid, carrying the smell of cotton fields and red clay dust and the particular scent of the Mississippi Delta in summer. A mixture of growing things and dying things, and the river that ran through it all like a dark artery. The juke joint called Big Sam's was the only place to be that night if you were black and looking for entertainment in Clarksdale. It sat on the edge of town, right where the paved streets gave way to dirt roads, right where respectability gave way to the wilder, freer world of Saturday night blues and dancing and whiskey that burned going down, but made everything else feel better for a few hours. The building itself was nothing special, nothing that would attract attention or admiration. Just a large room built from rough lumber that had weathered to grey over the years. The tin roof had rusted in places and leaked when it rained hard. The windows were just openings in the walls with wooden shutters that could be closed, but rarely were because the building needed every bit of air circulation it could get. The floor was packed dirt, mixed with sawdust that got tracked everywhere and stuck to shoes and created a perpetual haze of dust particles, floating in whatever light managed to penetrate the dim interior. Word had spread throughout Clarksdale and the surrounding areas that Robert Johnson was coming to play at Big Sam's that Saturday night. The news traveled through the community the way important news always traveled, person to person, conversation to conversation, spreading outward in concentric circles from some unknown origin point until everyone who cared to know had heard. Robert Johnson. The name carried weight by June of 1937. People knew who he was, knew his reputation, knew the stories. The young guitarist who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere 2 years earlier with a talent that defied explanation, that made experienced musicians shake their heads in disbelief and wonder how it was possible for someone to improve that much that fast. The man who could make one guitar sound like 2 or 3 instruments playing at once, who could play rhythms that seemed to require multiple people, who could sing in a voice that ranged from a whisper to a shout and carried more emotion in a single line than most people felt in their entire lives. When word got out that Robert Johnson was coming to Big Sam's, people started making plans, started finishing their work early so they could get there in time for a good spot, started putting aside a few coins for the cover charge and drinks, started getting ready for what they knew would be a special night, because Robert Johnson didn't come through town that often, and when he did, you didn't want to miss it. You didn't want to be the person who stayed home and then had to listen to everyone else talk about what you had missed. By 9 o'clock that evening, Big Sam's was packed. Bodies everywhere. People packed shoulder to shoulder, standing along the walls where the rough lumber pressed against their backs and occasionally caught on clothing. People sitting on whatever surfaces they could find, perched on windowsills and leaning against support posts, and crowding around the few tables that dotted the room. People filling every available space in that rough lumber building with its tin roof that amplified the heat and its dirt floor that had been trampled by thousands of feet over the years, until it was packed as hard as concrete. Someone later went through and tried to count how many people had been inside Big Sam's that night. The number they arrived at was 87. 87 people crammed into a space that was meant to hold maybe 50 comfortably. 87 witnesses to what would become one of the most talked about and least understood events in Delta blues history. 87 people who would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what happened that night, trying to make sense of the impossible, trying to convince others who weren't there that yes, it really happened exactly the way they remembered it, that they weren't exaggerating or embellishing or allowing time to distort their memories. It happened. All of it. Every impossible detail. Robert Johnson arrived just after 9 o'clock. He walked through the door of Big Sam's, carrying his guitar case in one hand, wearing a suit that had seen better days but was still cleaner and nicer than what most people in that room could afford. The suit had been black once, but had faded to a dark grey. The shirt underneath was white, but yellowed with age and wear. His shoes were scuffed but polished as best as could be managed on the road. He was 26 years old that summer, though he looked both younger and older, depending on the light and the angle. Thin, almost gaunt, with prominent cheekbones and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. Eyes that had seen things and knew things and carried secrets that pressed down on him like that delta heat pressing down on everyone else. He moved through the crowd toward the small raised platform at the front of the room that served as a stage. It wasn't much of a stage, just a wooden platform maybe 6 inches higher than the rest of the floor, big enough for 2 or 3 musicians to stand on without crowding each other. Robert acknowledged greetings with nods as he passed through the crowd. People called out to him, said they were glad he was there, said they'd been looking forward to this all week. He nodded, smiled slightly, but didn't stop to talk to anyone. He had a show to do, and he was focused on that, already transitioning in his mind from the person who walked through the world to the person who stood on stage and made music that could move souls. He reached the stage and set his guitar case down carefully. The case was battered, covered in stickers and scratches and marks from years of travel, years of being loaded onto trains and buses and the backs of trucks, years of being the only protection between a valuable instrument and the rough treatment of constant movement. Robert opened the case and pulled out his guitar. It was an acoustic, well-worn but well-maintained, the wood polished smooth by years of hands sliding across it, the frets showing wear in the places where fingers pressed most often. The guitar had been with him for the past 2 years, the 2 years since his mysterious transformation from someone who could barely keep time on a harmonica to the most talented guitarist anyone in the Delta had ever heard. Some people said the guitar itself was part of the mystery, that it wasn't a normal instrument, that it had been given to him by the same dark forces that had given him his talent. Others said that was nonsense, that it was just a guitar, wood and strings and nothing more, and the talent was all Robert's, however he had acquired it. Robert didn't talk about it either way, didn't explain, didn't confirm or deny the stories, just played his guitar and let people think whatever they wanted to think. Outside Big Sam's, beyond the walls of rough lumber and the pools of lamplight that spilled from windows and doors, the town of Clarksdale was settling into its Saturday night rhythms. It was a small town by any standard, a few thousand people at most. But it felt even smaller because everyone knew everyone else's business, knew everyone else's secrets and struggles and small triumphs. The kind of town where news traveled fast and privacy was a luxury few people could afford. Families were finishing their evening meals, sitting around tables in small houses and eating whatever they had been able to afford or grow or catch. Children were playing in yards and streets in that brief window between dinner and bedtime, their voices carrying through the humid air, laughing and shouting and arguing the way children everywhere laugh and shout and argue. Parents were calling out warnings to stay close, to be careful, to come inside when the streetlights came on, even though there weren't many streetlights in the black section of town. And dogs. There were dogs everywhere. Clarksdale in 1937 had more dogs than people, or so it seemed if you walked through town and paid attention. Every family had at least one, usually more. They were working dogs mostly, kept to guard property and chase off unwanted visitors, and alert their owners to danger and sometimes to provide companionship in a world that was often harsh and lonely. Mixed breeds primarily, combinations of hound and terrier and shepherd and whatever else, had contributed to their lineage over generations. They ranged in size from small terriers that could fit in a basket to large mastiff mixes that weighed more than some of the children playing in the yards. They ranged in color from pure white to pure black, and every variation of brown and tan and spotted in between. Some were well-fed and sleek, others were thin, ribs showing, surviving on scraps and whatever they could scavenge. But all of them were doing what dogs do on a summer evening in Mississippi, sleeping on porches in whatever shade they could find, wandering the streets and alleys looking for food or adventure, or just movement to break up the boredom of another hot day, barking at shadows and strangers and other dogs, and sometimes at nothing at all, just barking because they were dogs, and that's what dogs did. The barking was constant background noise in Clarksdale, so constant that people had learned to ignore it the way you ignore the sound of wind through trees, or water running in a stream, or your own breathing. You only noticed it when it stopped, or when it changed in some significant way. Dogs barked all day and all night in varying patterns and intensities, a chaotic symphony that had no conductor and no score, just individual animals responding to individual stimuli in individual ways. Sometimes one dog would start barking and set off a chain reaction, half a dozen other dogs joining in until the noise level rose to something that demanded attention. But even that would fade after a few minutes as the dogs lost interest and returned to whatever they had been doing before. It was normal, expected, unremarkable. Just another aspect of life in a small southern town in the 1930s, where dogs were as much a part of the landscape as trees and dust and the relentless heat. But what was about to happen that night was not normal. What was about to happen was not expected or unremarkable or anything that could be dismissed as just another aspect of small-town life. What was about to happen would challenge everything people in Clarksdale thought they understood about dogs and music and the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. Inside Big Sam's, Robert Johnson finished tuning his guitar, turning the pegs with practiced ease, listening to each string with an attention that bordered on reverence, making minute adjustments until each one rang out clear and true and perfectly in harmony with the others. The crowd quieted down as they watched him tune, anticipation building like pressure before a storm. People who had seen Robert play before knew they were about to witness something special, something that would justify the heat and the crowding and the money they had spent to be there. People who had never seen him play had heard the stories and were eager, almost desperate, to find out if they were true, if this thin young man with the worn guitar could really do the things people claimed he could do. Robert stood on that small stage, looking out at the crowd of 87 people, watching him with expressions that ranged from curious to expectant to skeptical. He could feel their energy, their anticipation, their need for him to deliver something that would make this night memorable. He had felt it hundreds of times before, at hundreds of different venues throughout the Delta and beyond. It was always the same and always different, that moment before the first note, when anything was possible, when the crowd was still separate from the music, still observers rather than participants. His job was to change that, to break down that wall between performer and audience, to create something that would pull them all into the same space, the same emotional territory, the same experience. He took a breath, positioned his fingers on the frets, and began to play. The first song was one of his own compositions, one he had written months earlier and had been performing regularly since then. It had a driving rhythm that immediately grabbed attention, an insistent beat that made it almost impossible to stand still. His fingers moved across the frets with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for one person to produce, creating a bass line and a melody and a rhythm all at once, making the guitar sound like multiple instruments playing in perfect coordination. His right hand alternated between strumming and picking individual notes, creating complex patterns that shifted and evolved as the song progressed. His voice, when he started singing, was high and lonesome and full of pain, cutting through the hot air of that packed room like a knife through butter, demanding attention even from people who had been talking or drinking or focused on something else. The lyrics spoke of hard times and harder roads, of women who left and work that never ended, and the constant struggle to survive in a world that seemed designed to crush you if you weren't careful, if you didn't stay alert, if you didn't keep moving. The crowd responded immediately, as crowds always did when Robert Johnson played. People started swaying, started moving to the rhythm, started nodding their heads and tapping their feet and letting the music into their bodies and their minds. Conversations stopped, drinks were set down and temporarily forgotten. Everyone's attention focused on the stage, on this thin young man making sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal human ability. And then it started. Not immediately, not with the first notes, but within seconds, within the first few bars of that opening song, something began to happen outside Big Sam's, something that would make this night legendary, something that 87 people inside a juke joint and hundreds more throughout Clarksdale would never forget for the rest of their lives, no matter how long they lived or what else they experienced. The dogs started howling. Not one dog, not a few dogs responding to each other the way dogs sometimes do, creating a brief chorus before losing interest and moving on to something else. Every dog in Clarksdale, every single one. Dogs on porches jerked awake from sleep and lifted their heads and pointed their noses at the sky and howled. Dogs in yards stopped whatever they were doing, stopped digging or playing or eating and howled. Dogs that had been sleeping under houses in the cool dirt crawled out into the evening heat and howled. Dogs that had been walking the streets stopped walking and planted their feet and howled. Strays and pets, working dogs and lapdogs, old dogs that hadn't made noise in years, and young puppies barely old enough to make any sound beyond whimpering, all of them howling at once. Not barking, howling. That long, mournful sound that dogs make when they're calling to each other across distances, or mourning something lost, or responding to sirens, or expressing some emotion that humans can only guess at. A chorus of canine voices rising up into the Mississippi night, hundreds of dogs distributed throughout Clarksdale, all making the same sound at the same time, all oriented in the same direction like compass needles all pointing north. All pointed toward the center of town, all pointed toward where the juke joints were. All pointed, though they couldn't have known it, directly at Big Sam's, where Robert Johnson had just started playing his guitar. Inside the juke joint, people heard it immediately. You couldn't not hear it even over the music, even over the sound of Robert's guitar and voice. The howling started as a distant sound, barely noticeable at first. Easy to dismiss as just normal dog noise if you weren't paying close attention. But within seconds, it grew louder, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. The volume increased, not because individual dogs were howling louder, but because more dogs were joining in. The sound spreading outward like ripples from a stone dropped in water, each dog triggering the next, until every canine throat in Clarksdale was opened and producing that same mournful note. People in the crowd looked at each other with expressions that mixed confusion and concern. What was happening? Why were the dogs making that sound? And why all at once? It wasn't normal dog behavior. Everyone in that room had lived in Clarksdale their whole lives. They knew dogs. They knew what normal sounded like, and this wasn't it. This was coordinated in a way that dogs shouldn't be capable of coordinating. This was purposeful in a way that suggested response rather than random noise. This was wrong in a way that made the hair stand up on the back of your neck and your skin prickle with the ancient instinct that told you something was not right. Something was happening that fell outside the boundaries of normal experience. Robert kept playing. He didn't stop, didn't pause, didn't acknowledge the growing noise from outside. His eyes were closed, his head tilted back slightly, his body swaying gently to the rhythm of his own music, completely absorbed in what he was doing. Lost in the music or deliberately ignoring the distraction, it was impossible to tell which. But he kept playing, his fingers never missing a note, his voice never wavering, maintaining the driving rhythm and complex melody as if nothing unusual was happening. But the people in the crowd were distracted now, their attention divided between the music on stage and the impossible sound coming from outside. Some people moved toward the windows, pressing their faces against the openings to see if they could spot what was causing this phenomenon. Others moved toward the door, curiosity overcoming their desire to watch Robert play. A man named Samuel Green, who was standing near the door because he'd arrived late and couldn't get any closer to the stage, pulled the door open and stepped outside to investigate. What he saw made him stop moving, made his breath catch in his throat, made his mind struggle to process what his eyes were reporting. Every dog he could see was howling, not some dogs, not most dogs. Every single dog within his line of sight. Dogs on the porch of the house across the street, 3 of them standing side by side with their noses pointed skyward. Dogs in the yard next door. A mother and her half-grown puppies, all making the same sound in unison. Dogs further down the road, visible in the dim light spilling from other houses and buildings, all frozen in the same position, all producing the same mournful howl. It wasn't the normal scattered barking and howling that happened in any town with a significant dog population. This was coordinated, synchronized, like an orchestra following a conductor's baton. Even though there was no conductor, no visible reason for this level of coordination. The sound was overwhelming. Hundreds of individual voices blending into a single, massive howl that filled the air and echoed off buildings and seemed to press down on Samuel like a physical weight. He stood there in the doorway of Big Sam's for a full minute, maybe longer, unable to move, unable to process what he was experiencing, his rational mind trying desperately to find an explanation that made sense, while his instincts screamed that something was wrong, something was happening that shouldn't be possible. Finally, he turned back into the juke joint, his face showing such obvious shock and confusion that people near the door immediately asked what was wrong, what he'd seen, what was happening out there. Samuel tried to explain, but found that words were inadequate to describe what he'd witnessed. How do you convey the wrongness of seeing every dog behaving the same way at the same time? How do you explain the feeling of hearing hundreds of dogs howling in perfect unison? Finally, he just said, "You need to come see this." All the dogs, every single one of them, they're all howling. All at the same time, all facing this direction. You have to see it to believe it. More people moved toward the door and windows, pushing past each other in their eagerness to see what Samuel was talking about, to confirm whether his description was accurate or exaggerated. They looked out and saw exactly what Samuel had seen. Dogs everywhere, as far as they could see in the limited light of a Mississippi evening, all howling, all oriented toward Big Sam's, all producing that same mournful sound that seemed to carry meaning, even though no human could understand what that meaning was. The entire crowd inside Big Sam's was buzzing now, talking over Robert's playing, trying to make sense of what was happening, offering theories and explanations that ranged from plausible to absurd. Maybe there was a fire somewhere and the dogs could smell smoke. Maybe there was a storm coming and the dogs could sense the change in air pressure. Maybe someone was hurt and calling for help and the dogs could hear frequencies that humans couldn't. But none of these explanations fit the facts. There was no smoke, no storm on the horizon, no human sound that would cause this reaction. And even if there were, it wouldn't explain the coordination, wouldn't explain why every dog was facing the same direction, wouldn't explain why they had all started at essentially the same moment. Robert kept playing. He had opened his eyes now, had seen the crowd's distraction and confusion, had heard the howling from outside, though his expression didn't change, didn't show surprise or concern or anything beyond the intense focus he always brought to his performances. He transitioned smoothly from the first song into a second, his fingers never missing a note, his voice never wavering, maintaining the same intensity and skill he always brought to his music. And outside, the howling continued, loud, persistent, unrelenting, a constant background noise that was impossible to ignore and impossible to explain. A woman named Bessie Carter lived 3 blocks from Big Sam's, in a small house she shared with her husband and 3 children. She had not gone to the juke joint that night. Saturday evening was when she caught up on housework and got her children ready for church the next morning. She had been in her kitchen washing dishes when the howling started. At first, she didn't pay much attention. Dogs howled all the time. It was background noise, part of the soundtrack of life in Clarksdale. But as the sound continued and grew louder, as it became clear this wasn't normal dog behavior, Bessie stopped what she was doing and paid attention. Her own dog, an old hound that spent most of its time sleeping on the porch and rarely made noise anymore, suddenly stood up from its usual spot by the fireplace, where it liked to lie even in summer, walked to the middle of the room, and began to howl. Not bark, howl. A long, mournful sound that Bessie had never heard from this particular dog before. The sound made the hair on Bessie's arms stand up. There was something wrong about it, something that triggered instinctive alarm. She called to her husband, who was in the other room putting their youngest child to bed. He came out looking annoyed at the interruption, but his expression changed when he heard their dog howling and saw the look on Bessie's face. Together they went to the window and looked out at their street. Every dog they could see was doing the same thing, their neighbors' dogs, the stray that usually roamed the alley behind their house. The dogs belonging to the family 3 houses down, all of them standing or sitting, all of them with their noses pointed upward, all of them howling in unison. Bessie's husband was a practical man, a farmer who had seen most of what life in Mississippi could throw at you and had developed a strong skepticism toward anything that seemed unusual or unexplainable. But even he was disturbed by what he saw and heard. He went to the door, stepped out onto the porch, and immediately the full force of the sound hit him. It wasn't just their street. It wasn't just their neighborhood. It was everywhere, the entire town. Hundreds of dogs, maybe more, all howling at once. The sound filled the air, created a chorus that was both beautiful in its coordination and deeply disturbing in its implications. He stood there listening, his practical mind trying to find an explanation, trying to categorize this experience into something he could understand and control. And as he listened, he realized something. The howling wasn't random. It had a direction. All the dogs weren't just howling. They were howling towards something. He could tell by the way they were positioned, by the orientation of their bodies. They were all facing downtown, all facing toward where the juke joints were, all facing toward where music would be playing on a Saturday night. He came back inside and found Bessie standing in the kitchen with their dog, which was still howling, and he said, "Something's happening downtown. Something with the music. The dogs are all facing that direction, all of them." Back at Big Sam's, the crowd was becoming increasingly agitated. The initial confusion had given way to something approaching fear. This wasn't normal, this wasn't explainable, and it wasn't stopping. Some people wanted to leave, wanted to go check on their own homes and families, wanted to see if their own dogs were part of this phenomenon. Others wanted to stay, sensing that something important was happening, something they needed to witness, even though it frightened them. They were caught between the desire to flee from something they didn't understand and the desire to see it through to whatever conclusion awaited. Robert Johnson played his 3rd song, then his 4th. And the howling outside never stopped, never diminished, never changed in its fundamental character. It was constant, overwhelming, a wall of sound that pressed in on the building from all sides. A musician named Johnny Shines was in the crowd that night. Johnny was in his early 20s, already making a name for himself on the juke joint circuit, already recognized as talented, though not in the same league as Robert Johnson. Johnny would later become a respected and successful blues musician in his own right, would record albums and give concerts, and become one of the last living links to the Delta blues era before his death in 1992. Throughout his long career, Johnny Shines gave hundreds of interviews about the blues, about the Delta, about the musicians he had known and played with. And he always, without exception, mentioned that night at Big Sam's when asked about Robert Johnson. In interviews conducted decades later, when he was an old man, when the events of that night had been filtered through the lens of 50 or 60 years of memory and reflection, Johnny would try to put into words what he had felt in that room. He would say, "I've been to thousands of shows, seen thousands of musicians, played with hundreds of them. But that night at Big Sam's was different from anything I experienced before or since. The air in that room felt heavy, thick, like it had weight and substance. It felt electric, like the moment before lightning strikes, when your skin tingles and your hair stands up. It felt like reality was bending somehow, like the normal rules that governed the world had been temporarily suspended and we were operating under different physics, different laws." He would pause, searching for words that could adequately convey the experience. And those dogs outside, those hundreds of dogs howling in unison for hours, that wasn't random. That wasn't coincidence. They were responding to Robert's music. I know how that sounds. I know people think I'm exaggerating or misremembering or allowing legend to overwrite fact. But I was there. I heard it. And I watched. I watched Robert play, and I watched how the howling changed with his music. When he played faster, more intensely, the howling became more intense. When he slowed down, played something softer and sadder, the howling changed tone, became less urgent. It was connected, the music and the dogs. Connected in a way that shouldn't be possible, that violates everything we understand about how music works and how animals behave. But it happened. I was there. And it happened. By the end of Robert's fifth song, about 45 minutes into his performance, some people in the crowd started to notice what Johnny Shines had noticed. The correlation between Robert's playing and the intensity of the howling outside. It wasn't perfect, wasn't immediate, but it was there. When Robert played something fast and driving, the howling seemed to increase in volume and urgency. When he played something slower, something more melancholy, the howling seemed to match that emotional tone. A man near the stage, someone who had been watching Robert closely and listening to the dogs with equal attention, called out during a brief pause between songs, "Robert, stop playing for a minute. Just stop. I want to see what happens. I want to see if those dogs are really responding to you or if this is all just crazy coincidence." Robert looked at the man for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slightly and let his hands fall away from his guitar. The final notes of the last song faded into silence. Robert stood on that small stage, guitar hanging from the strap around his neck, hands at his sides, waiting, and outside the howling changed. It didn't stop completely, didn't cut off like a switch being flipped, but it diminished noticeably, became less intense, less urgent, less coordinated. Individual dogs started to quiet, breaking off from the chorus until the sound had reduced to maybe a quarter of its previous volume. The crowd in Big Sam's fell absolutely silent, everyone straining to hear, to confirm what they thought they were hearing. Then Robert lifted his hands back to his guitar, positioned his fingers on the frets, and started playing again, launching into another song with the same intensity and skill he had brought to all the others. And immediately, within seconds, the howling outside swelled back to its previous intensity. Dogs that had quieted started up again. The chorus rebuilt itself, reformed, became once again that overwhelming wall of sound that pressed in on the building from all sides. The correlation was undeniable. Impossible to dismiss as coincidence or imagination, impossible to explain through any normal understanding of cause and effect. When Robert Johnson played, the dogs howled. When he stopped, they quieted. When he resumed, they resumed. His music was somehow calling to them, commanding them, controlling them in a way that transcended normal animal behavior and normal musical influence. The implications of this realization spread through the crowd like a wave, like a physical force that you could feel pressing against you. People who had been skeptical of the stories about Robert Johnson, about his mysterious improvement, about the rumors of crossroads and deals with dark forces, suddenly found those stories more credible, more believable. How else could you explain this? What natural phenomenon could cause every dog in town to respond in unison to one man's guitar playing? What normal set of circumstances could create this level of coordination and control? A woman named Dorothy Williams was in the crowd that night. Dorothy was a school teacher, one of the few black women in Clarksdale who had managed to get enough education to hold that position. She prided herself on rational thinking, on scientific understanding, on approaching the world through logic and reason rather than superstition and folklore. She had come to Big Sam's that night partly to hear Robert Johnson play because she appreciated good music, and partly to prove to herself that the stories about him were exaggerated, that his talent was simply the result of practice and natural ability rather than anything supernatural. But what she experienced that night challenged everything she believed about how the world worked. Several days later, she sat down and wrote a detailed account of the evening in her personal journal, trying to process what she had witnessed, trying to reconcile it with her understanding of reality. That journal entry survived, was found decades later by her granddaughter, and eventually donated to a historical archive. The relevant section reads, "I witnessed something tonight that defies all logic and reason. I'm an educated woman. I have studied biology and animal behavior. I understand the principles that govern the natural world, and I cannot explain what happened at Big Sam's. I cannot explain how every dog in Clarksdale responded in unison to Robert Johnson's music. I cannot explain the coordination, the timing, the correlation between his playing and their howling. The only conclusion I can reach, as impossible and irrational as it seems, as much as it violates everything I have been taught and everything I believe, is that Robert Johnson's music contains something beyond normal sound waves, something that speaks to animals in a language they cannot resist, something that reaches across species boundaries and triggers responses that should not be possible. The stories about him must be true. I don't know what that means or how to understand it, but after tonight, I believe them." Robert Johnson played for 3 hours that night, 3 full hours without significant break, moving from song to song with only brief pauses to tune or take a drink of water that someone handed up to the stage. His energy never flagged. His skill never diminished. His voice never cracked or failed, despite the heat and the length of the performance. He played his own compositions and traditional blues numbers and songs he had learned from other musicians. He played fast-driving rhythms and slow, mournful ballads. He played slide guitar with a bottleneck that made sounds like crying, like laughing, like the whistle of a train in the distance. He played with his eyes closed and his eyes open, standing still and moving to the rhythm, alone in his music and connected to the crowd. And for those entire 3 hours, for every minute of his performance, the dogs outside howled. The sound became the backdrop to everything else, became so constant that people almost stopped hearing it as a separate phenomenon and started hearing it as part of the music itself, another instrument in the ensemble, a chorus of animal voices accompanying Robert's guitar and singing. Throughout Clarksdale, people who weren't at the juke joint, who had no idea what was causing this unprecedented phenomenon, grew increasingly disturbed as the howling continued. 3 hours is a long time. Long enough for initial curiosity to give way to concern, for concern to give way to fear, for fear to give way to something approaching panic. This wasn't normal, and it wasn't stopping, and nobody could explain it. Parents gathered their children inside, locked doors, closed shutters, tried to create barriers between themselves and whatever was happening out there in the darkness. Families huddled together in kitchens and living rooms, praying, asking God for protection against whatever was causing their dogs to behave this way. Several people later reported that they got down on their knees that night and prayed with a fervor they hadn't felt since childhood, prayed like they were facing Judgment Day, prayed like the world was ending and only divine intervention could save them. The sound of hundreds of dogs howling in unison for 3 straight hours was something out of a nightmare. Something that made people question the stability of reality itself, made them wonder if this was some kind of omen or warning or sign of coming disaster. Some people, the ones who were more spiritually minded, thought it might be the end times, thought this might be one of the signs mentioned in Revelation, thought Jesus might be coming back that very night. Others, the ones who were more pragmatic, thought there might be a natural disaster coming, an earthquake or a flood or something else catastrophic that the dogs could sense with their sharper senses and were warning about. But as the hours passed and no disaster materialized, as the howling continued without any obvious cause or purpose, people began to accept that this was something else entirely, something that didn't fit into their understanding of how the world worked. Something inexplicable and therefore terrifying in the way that only the truly unknown can be terrifying. At Big Sam's, the 87 people inside the juke joint had moved past fear and into a kind of awed acceptance. Yes, this was impossible. Yes, it shouldn't be happening. But it was happening right now, right in front of them, and they were witnessing it. They were part of something that would be talked about for generations, something that would become legend and folklore, something that proved the world was stranger and more mysterious than most people wanted to acknowledge. Some people in the crowd had started dancing again, had returned to the normal juke joint behavior of moving to the rhythm and enjoying the music. If reality was going to bend tonight, if impossible things were going to happen, you might as well dance. Might as well enjoy the music, might as well embrace the strangeness rather than fight it. Others stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away from Robert Johnson on that small stage. They watched him with expressions that mixed awe and fear and something that looked almost like worship. This thin young man, whose music could command every dog in town, whose talent seemed to come from somewhere beyond the human realm, who was proving right now in real time that the stories about him weren't exaggerated, weren't folklore, weren't myths created to make a good musician seem better than he really was. A few people did leave during those 3 hours, too frightened to stay, too disturbed by what was happening to remain in the building where it was centered. They slipped out the door during pauses between songs, hurried away into the night, went home, and tried to forget what they had witnessed. But most people stayed because they had to know how it would end. Stayed because they were witnessing something that transcended entertainment, that had moved into the territory of the miraculous or the supernatural or whatever you wanted to call events that violated natural law. Stayed because leaving would have been an admission that they were too scared to see it through, and pride or curiosity or simple stubborn determination kept them rooted in place. Around midnight, 3 hours after he had started playing, after he had performed maybe 20 or 25 songs, after he had given everything he had to give and proven, beyond any doubt, that his reputation was deserved and his talent was real, and the stories about him had, if anything, understated rather than exaggerated his abilities, Robert Johnson played his final song of the night. It was a slow song, mournful and beautiful, a blues that spoke of loss and longing and roads that stretched on forever with no destination and no hope of return. His voice, which had remained strong throughout the entire 3-hour performance, took on an even deeper quality for this final number, resonating with emotion that seemed to come from some place beyond technique or performance. His guitar wept, the notes bending and sliding in ways that made the instrument sound almost human, almost like it was crying. Outside, the howling seemed to match the emotional tone of the music, became less urgent, more sorrowful, shifted from a cry of response to something that sounded almost like mourning. Robert played the final verse, sang the final lines about being a long way from home and not knowing if he'd ever get back. Then he played the final phrase, let the last note ring out, sustain, hang in the air for a long moment. His hands lifted from the strings. The note faded slowly, gradually, diminishing until it was gone, and silence filled the space where music had been. And outside, as if a switch had been flipped, as if a spell had been broken, as if some invisible thread connecting all those dogs to Robert Johnson's music had been suddenly cut, the howling stopped. Not gradually, not one dog at a time, slowly quieting down the way normal howling would fade, all at once, instantly. Complete silence, where moments before there had been the sound of hundreds of howling animals. The sudden absence of sound was almost as shocking as the howling itself had been. It created a void, an emptiness that felt almost physical. People in Big Sam's stood in stunned silence. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody seemed to breathe. The only sounds were the natural sounds of an old building settling, of fabric rustling as people shifted their weight, of hearts beating in chests. The silence stretched out, became uncomfortable, became oppressive. Finally, someone coughed, and the spell was broken. People started talking, started moving, started trying to process what they had just experienced. Robert Johnson didn't say anything, didn't address the crowd, didn't acknowledge what had happened, didn't offer any explanation or comment. He simply put his guitar back in its case with the same care he always showed his instrument, closed the clasps with deliberate movements, picked up the case by its handle. He looked out at the crowd of 87 people one final time. His expression was unreadable. Might have been satisfaction at a performance well done. Might have been sadness at something. Might have been resignation or acceptance or any number of emotions that you could project onto a face that revealed nothing clearly. He nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of the audience's attention. Then he stepped down from the stage and walked through the crowd toward the door. People moved aside to let him pass, creating a path through the packed room. Some reached out to touch him as he passed, to make physical contact with someone who had just demonstrated abilities that seemed superhuman. He didn't stop, didn't slow down, just walked steadily toward the exit. He pushed open the door and stepped out into the Mississippi night. The door swung closed behind him, and Robert Johnson was gone, disappearing into the darkness, walking down that dirt road away from Big Sam's, guitar case in hand, leaving behind 87 witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what they had experienced and why it mattered. For several minutes after Robert left, nobody else moved. The crowd remained inside Big Sam's, standing or sitting in the same positions they had occupied during the performance, unable or unwilling to break the moment, to return to normal life after what they had witnessed. Finally, slowly, people started to leave. They filed out into the night, stepping onto the dirt road, looking around at a town that seemed unchanged despite everything that had happened. The dogs were quiet now, back to normal behavior, sleeping or wandering or doing whatever dogs did on a Saturday night. No evidence remained of the 3 hours of coordinated howling, except the memories of the people who had heard it, and the lingering sense that something profound and inexplicable had occurred. People walked home through the warm night, alone or in small groups, talking in low voices about what they had witnessed, trying to make sense of it, trying to fit it into their understanding of how the world worked. Some people went straight home and went to bed, exhausted from the experience, wanting sleep to take them away from thoughts that were too big and too strange to process. Others stayed up late, sitting on porches or gathered in kitchens, drinking coffee or something stronger, talking through what had happened, offering theories and explanations that ranged from scientific to supernatural. By Sunday morning, the entire town knew something extraordinary had happened Saturday night. The story spread through Clarksdale like a fire in dry grass, person to person, house to house, expanding and mutating as all stories do, but maintaining a consistent core. Robert Johnson had played at Big Sam's. During his performance, every dog in town had howled for 3 hours straight. When he stopped playing, they stopped howling. 87 people had witnessed it directly. Hundreds more had heard the howling from their homes throughout town. It wasn't rumor or speculation or second-hand information. It was verified fact, confirmed by more witnesses than most historical events can claim. The question wasn't whether it had happened. The question was what it meant. Preachers addressed it from their pulpits that Sunday morning. Some condemned Robert Johnson, called him an agent of dark forces, warned their congregations to stay away from his music and his performances, cited scripture about false prophets and deceivers, about the devil appearing as an angel of light, about the dangers of being seduced by talent that came from unholy sources. Others took a more measured approach, acknowledging that something unusual had occurred, but cautioning against jumping to supernatural conclusions, suggesting that there might be natural explanations that science simply hadn't discovered yet. A few brave souls suggested that maybe what had happened was a blessing rather than a curse, a demonstration of the power of music to reach across boundaries and connect with creation in ways that transcended normal understanding. But whether they condemned it or celebrated it or tried to explain it away, every preacher in Clarksdale addressed it because every member of every congregation was talking about it, and ignoring it would have been impossible. Throughout the following weeks, people continued to discuss and debate what had happened that night at Big Sam's. The event took on a life of its own, became a lens through which people viewed Robert Johnson and his music. Some people who had been fans became even more devoted, convinced they were witnessing something historic, something that proved Robert's music transcended normal boundaries and connected with something primal and powerful. Others who had been fans pulled back, frightened by the implications, unwilling to expose themselves further to music that seemed to carry supernatural influence. And people who had never paid much attention to Robert Johnson suddenly became very interested, wanting to see for themselves if the stories were true, wanting to witness firsthand whether this young guitarist really did possess abilities that went beyond normal musical talent. Robert Johnson himself never publicly commented on the incident. He continued traveling throughout the Delta, playing shows at juke joints and house parties, making a living with his music the way he always had. If anyone asked him directly about that night in Clarksdale, about the dogs howling for 3 hours, about the undeniable correlation between his playing and their response, he would deflect the question. Would say something vague about animals being sensitive to music, about sound affecting creatures in ways humans don't fully understand, about not knowing why it happened but being grateful for the opportunity to play for an engaged audience. He never confirmed or denied the supernatural implications, never claimed to have special powers or to have made any kind of deal for his abilities. Just played his guitar and sang his songs and let people interpret it however they wanted to interpret it. The event at Big Sam's became one of the central stories in Robert Johnson mythology. It appears in biographies and documentaries. It gets discussed in academic papers about folklore and legend. It shows up in novels and songs and films that use Robert Johnson as a character or inspiration. Some versions of the story exaggerate the details, add elements that weren't part of the original testimonies. Some versions downplay it, treat it as an amusing anecdote or a tall tale rather than a documented event with multiple witnesses. But the core story persists because it's based on real testimony from real people who experienced something they couldn't explain. You can dismiss one person's account as exaggeration or misperception. You can't as easily dismiss 87 people inside the juke joint and hundreds more throughout town, all reporting essentially the same phenomenon. Something happened that night. Something that challenged normal understanding of cause and effect, of music and animal behavior, of the boundaries between natural and supernatural. Whether you believe it was genuinely supernatural or some natural phenomenon science hasn't yet explained is up to you. But you can't deny that it happened. The witnesses are too numerous, the accounts too consistent. The event too well documented for a small town in the 1930s. Today, if you visit Clarksdale, Mississippi, you can still find people who remember the stories passed down from grandparents and great-grandparents who were there that night. The building that housed Big Sam's is long gone, torn down in the 1950s, replaced first by a parking lot and later by a small commercial building that has itself been through several incarnations. But the memory persists in the community. The story gets told and retold, passed down through generations, a piece of local folklore that happens to be true. And every time someone plays Robert Johnson's music in Clarksdale, every time those scratchy 1930s recordings echo through modern speakers, old-timers pay attention to their dogs. Watch to see if they react. Wonder if maybe the power that Robert Johnson carried in his music is still there somehow, still capable of reaching across decades and species boundaries to affect creatures in ways that logic says shouldn't be possible. Most of the time, nothing happens. Dogs sleep or play or ignore the music the way they ignore most human activities. But occasionally, very occasionally, someone reports that their dog lifted its head when Robert Johnson's voice came through the speakers, pricked up its ears, whined softly, as if it heard something in that music that humans can't hear. As if some echo of that night in June 1937 still resonates in the recordings, still carries a trace of whatever power caused every dog in Clarksdale to howl for 3 straight hours. This is the story of that night. The story of an event that has been documented by multiple sources, confirmed by numerous witnesses, preserved in testimony and records and folk memory. The story of a time when music transcended entertainment and became something else, something that reached across boundaries, something that demonstrated that Robert Johnson's talent came from somewhere beyond normal human ability. Whether that somewhere was supernatural or simply an aspect of natural law we don't yet understand, is for you to decide. But the facts remain. On June 12, 1937, Robert Johnson played at Big Sam's Juke joint in Clarksdale, Mississippi. 87 people were in attendance. Robert played for 3 hours. During those entire 3 hours, every dog in Clarksdale howled. When Robert stopped playing, the howling stopped, immediately, completely, as if it had been controlled. As if those hundreds of animals had been responding to a command that only they could hear. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for considering the possibility that the world contains mysteries we haven't solved, phenomena we haven't explained, events that challenge our understanding of what's possible. Whether you believe this story represents genuine supernatural occurrence or simply a natural phenomenon science will someday explain, the historical record is clear. It happened. The witnesses existed. The event was real. And somewhere in that reality lies a truth about Robert Johnson, about his music, about the power of sound to reach across species and affect the world in ways we're only beginning to understand.